Alright, so we haven't had a caliber discussion in a while, and I have a lot of new subscribers, so it's time to get everybody up to speed on exactly what's going on with your AR-10 size calibers. One of the most important things that you need to remember, though, is if you'd like to help support me directly, the best way to do that is purchase a patch from my shoponlytacticalfans.com store. They're putting the squeeze on me. Now I have to go to every single court date, and there's like one once a month. Trip across the country and back, hotels and gas and everything, that's between like $3,000 to $5,000. So my monthly expenses just increased by about, we'll cut the difference, $4,000. Selling these patches is the only thing that's preventing me from having to take a plea deal. Anywho, let's get going here. So, now when we're talking about calibers, you have to understand that there's restrictions. Because otherwise, the answer would be 50 cal. That'd be the answer for everything. You want the best caliber? 50 cal. And if you want the best caliber that shoots long range, well, you know, then you're looking at, what is it, like a 408 Chi-Tech or something like that. So you have to put restrictions on it to be able to talk about a particular caliber. The restrictions we're going to be putting on today is gas gun restrictions. So the reason we're going with gas guns, and we're picking a particular gas gun, because now like an AR-15 style receiver, totally different argument. Like there are their own calibers there. We are looking at a 308 size receiver that's an AR-10 magazine. What can we put in there to get the best possible performance? And there's a couple of things you need to look at. One is availability. We're not looking at hand loads. Hand loads are coming off the table because obviously, typically, if somebody's watching one of these caliber things, they're thinking about getting into a particular style of shooting. In this particular one we're talking about AR-10 receivers with an AR-10 magazine. The reloading equipment isn't available yet. Yes, later, down the road, you can start hand loading and do whatever you want, but we are looking for a caliber you can purchase directly off the shelf at practically any store. What is available? Now, what is a caliber limited by? Two factors. One, the amount of powder you can shove inside the casing. Number two, the twist on the barrel. So, for example, we'll pick on 30 cal. So a 30 cal inside of an AR-10 magazine, you cannot maximize the potential of that particular caliber. To maximize the potential of that particular caliber is a 1 in 7 twist barrel. With a 1 in 7 twist barrel, you can run the longest, best aerodynamic bullets possible. But because the amount of powder that's inside of a 308 case is not sufficient enough to propel a 308 projectile at its maximum potential, you can't go with maximum potential bullets in a 308 caliber. That's when you have to move up to like a 300 PRC or something like that if you want to maximize the 30 cal. So in the particular caliber, which is a 308 size case because it's got to fit inside of a 308 magazine, the only one that can maximize the projectile would be a 6mm 243 6mm Creedmoor, something like that, because that is light enough where you can get the proper velocity to have an effective bullet with that amount of powder. Now, obviously the 6mm Creedmoor is going to outperform the 243 all the way, because when they made the 243 they were not looking at long range performance. They were looking at more of like a varmint cartridge. So the amount of space that you can have the amount of room that you have to push your projectile out to go with longer projectiles just isn't there. So if you go with a longer projectile, you have to start shoving it inside of the case. And when you have a whole bunch of projectile inside of the case, when the powder burns, if this side burns like, I don't actually know times, but I'm going to make some shit up here, like a millisecond faster, it can tweak the projectile and screw up your accuracy. Plus then you get bad chronograph readings. So instead of being like a 10 foot per second variant, you might have a 200 foot per second variant. And I can attest to that. My 243 from shot to shot can vary as much as 200 feet per second. Now it doesn't really seem to affect my long range accuracy. Like I'm still shooting 1 MOA. Now if I shoot a string of like 10 rounds, then I'm not at 1 MOA anymore. But like a 5 round string, yeah, 1 MOA. So I'm starting to think that, you know, like this one's 200 feet per second faster, and this one's 200 feet per second slower, so that's a 400 foot per second, or wait, no, 200 feet per second variance. So if I have one that's all the way on the low end and all the way on the high end, that's probably what breaks me out of the 1 MOA. The problem with 6mm Creedmoor is it's just not available. It's not on the shelf. Yeah, your special gun shop might have it there, but when I'm talking about on the shelf, I'm talking about major chains. Walmart, Fleet Farm, Kmart, stuff like that, like a major chain. Dick's Sporting Goods. Now, I recommend you don't shop there, but I'm just using that as an example. Like, we're looking at major chain availability. And in my particular area, the major chains are Walmart and Fleet Farm. Those are your two major chains. So it may be different for you, but what's available in my major chains is it's actually 168 grain 308, but I don't want to hear a bunch of people go like, oh, if you just went with a 175, you'd get better performance, because the 308 is going to lose ballistically. It just is, because there's not enough powder in the case to push that projectile to the maximum potential of that particular projectile. So, I gave him the 175. The 175 is on the shelf, but 168 is way more common, and that should actually be the particular loading I went with. Then you got 6.5, 147 grain. That's on all the shelves. It's everywhere. 6.5, 147 grain. Now I get it. There's a whole bunch of different loadings for it, but that's what's available, at least in my area. Next one is 243 90 grain. Like, I had to special order 55 grain that time I wanted to bust up armor. What's on the shelf is 90 grain or 75. I chose 90 grain because it's a little bit better ballistically. Now, it is in one way and it is in another. Like the 75 grain, obviously for dropping that, it's going to outperform the 90. The 90 is going to outperform the 75 when it comes to wind drift. So, now, when we're talking about bolt and gas guns, going with a bolt gun when you can fit it in an AR-15 style receiver or an AR-10 style receiver is just stupid. That makes no sense at all. Bolt guns are way more expensive, incredibly more expensive. It is cheaper for you to build a gas gun than it is a bolt gun. For example, just the receiver on a bolt gun, you're looking at $2,000. Now you got another $1,500 in your chassis system, another $1,000 in your barrel. Your trigger, a bolt gun is incredibly more expensive than a gas gun. A gas gun and an AR-10, you can get an Armorlite set of receivers, which I recommend, great receivers, put together beautifully. You can get those receivers, I think, for like $400. So now you're a fourth of the cost in the action, a fourth. And with the bolt gun, you have to pay a machinist, unless you're savvy yourself, to put the whole thing together, because they got to headspace it and all of that. In AR-10, everything just goes together. You can put it together, you can assemble it right in your basement. Everything's already standardized. Now, there are differences from like AR-10 to DPMS, and DPMS is the one where you're going to find the most parts for, so you may want to go with the DPMS receiver. However, the head spacing is close enough between an Armorlite and a DPMS, and the barrel sleeve fits to where if you just roll the dice, it's probably going to be head spaced. And if it's not, you could actually send that into a machinist and get it corrected, but now you're taking the hardness out of the bolt. So it's a toss-up. Myself, when I did the Shredder project, I went with an AR-10 bolt, or Armorlite bolt, an Armorlite receiver, and then I went with a DPMS barrel. I checked the head spacing, which is super simple to do. There's 100 videos on how to do it. My head spacing was good, so I was A-okay. Anywho, getting back to the meat and potatoes. So it makes absolutely no sense, unless you're in some sort of special like competition where gas guns aren't allowed, to make a bolt gun in the smaller actions. That's your 6.5, your 308, your 6mm Creedmoor, your 243, 708. I'm sure I'm missing some there. If you go with a bolt gun, you're going to want to go to the Magnum calibers. 300 PRC, 338 Lapua, 300 Winchester Magnum, one of those. The bigger calibers. The only reason you go with a bolt gun is because you can't fit that particular caliber inside of the action. Now, I believe wholeheartedly a gas gun is maxed out at 800 yards. Not ballistically, not that they can't shoot farther, but the advantages you get from a gas gun fall off at 800 yards. Now, you could take that, plus or minus, depending on flight time, stuff like that. But we'll put you in this hypothetical situation. There's a target, 800 yards. If you shoot, you have to wait to see the splash before you can make a follow-up shot, and then the target's going to move. Unless it's a paper target, that's a different story, but we're talking about real targets here. So, with a bolt gun, you shoot, you see the splash, you rack the bolt, you do the math, like, okay, so here on my grid, it splashed right there, but I was aiming right there, so I need to move this dot up on top of the target, and then shoot again. The point is, the chances for a follow-up shot at 800 yards really aren't there. I mean, in some special niche circumstance, yeah, maybe. But realistically speaking, at 800 yards, you're limited to like one shot anyway. So why not go with a bigger caliber that breaks down the ballistics and makes it easier to hit on a first shot over a gas gun? The advantages, I feel, of a follow-up shot disappear at 800 yards. Again, there's probably special niche circumstances. So with a gas gun, you have the advantage of a follow-up shot. With a bolt gun, you have the advantage of running a better caliber. So there's less of a chance of you missing because you screw up your ballistics. Like you do the math wrong or something like that. It's easier to have those little mistakes be absorbed by a better caliber, where inside of 800 yards, where follow-up shots are very possible, it's easier to absorb those mistakes with just a second shot. You're like, oh, boom, oh, I missed, boom, not quite there, boom, got it. A bolt gun, you don't have that option, but you have a much better caliber. So past 800 yards, things are harder to calculate ballistically, so let's make it easier and run a better caliber. So let's talk about the ballistics, again, with all these limitations. So yes, all these calibers can be loaded different, but they're just not available. So, for 308, we're looking at, for drop, at 300 yards, 4.7 MOA. For 6.5, 4 MOA. For 243 90 grain, 2.9 MOA. That's almost half the drop at 300 yards that a 6.5 and a 308 has. And the difference between 6.5 and 308 at 300 yards is practically non-existent. 0.7, that's not even a full MOA. If you've ever looked through an MOA scope, that's pretty small. So that's less than 3 inches, we'll say about this, is the difference between 6.5 and 308. Negligible. 500 yards, this is when they start to really separate here. For 308, we got 11.7 MOA drop. 9.7 with 6.5, and 7.9 with 243. 800 yards. This is, again, where I consider the max for gas guns, and I'm going to go to a bolt gun. We got 26.1 MOA for a 308. 20.4 for a 6.5. 18.9 for a 243. I believe you can already see which one's the better caliber. Okay, now let's bring in the wind drift. Because obviously the heavier ones, in some cases, do a little bit better. So typically, not always, but typically, the lighter projectile out of all of them will drift a little bit more, depending on velocities, stuff like that. So at 300 yards, we got 2.2 for the 308, 1.5 for the 6.5, and we got 2.1 for the 243. These are what the targets look like right here at 300 yards. So there's virtually no difference. So because there's no difference, I would take the 243 because it's got less drop. Okay, let's push it out to 500 yards. We got 4 MOA with the 308, 2.6 with the 6.5, and 3.8 with the 243. Yeah, we're starting to see a real difference here. The difference between 6.5 and 243 is just a hair over 1 MOA. Is that 1 MOA difference enough difference to make a difference? In my opinion, no. So again, the 243 is still king all the way out to 500 yards. Again, there's a difference, but look at how much less drop you got. So with the less drop and barely a little bit more wind drift, I would be leaning towards the 243. Now 800 yards, this is where the rubber really meets the road. So we got 7.3 with the 308, 4.4 with the 6.5, and 7 with the 243. Now the 243 is still better than the 308 at 800 yards in every single class, but the 6.5 is where it's finally caught up to the 243. Now, just for comparison, just so you understand why a bolt gun performs so much better at 800 yards. Look at the ballistics on a 300 PRC. At 800 yards, 17.8 for drop. That's incredible. That even beats the 243. For wind drift, 3.6 MOA. At 800 yards, unless you have over a 9-mile-an-hour wind, you don't need to correct for wind. If you feel wind on the side of your face, just favor that side of the target and you'll hit unless there's over a 10-mile-an-hour wind. And if the trees are whipping side to side, maybe you should get a little bit closer or change your position to where the wind don't affect you. The point is, you're far more likely to score a hit on the target shooting something like a 300 PRC. And a 300 PRC is a hell of a caliber. I already went through the bolt gun discussions of different calibers. 300 PRC, especially if you hand load and go with like a 250, outperforms a 338 Lapua for a very long way. It's something like 2,000 yards or something like that, where a 338 Lapua finally overtakes a 300 PRC, but you have to be running like a 300 grain or like a 330 grain. The 300 PRC to the 338 Lapua is like 6.5 to the 308. It's more slender, plus there's enough power, not quite enough. You can't totally max out the 30 cal projectile. If you could, then it would be score bought with a 250, but there's not quite enough power to push that 250 fast enough, because most people agree 2,800 feet per second, anything below it, it's kind of the cutoff. So you can't quite get the 30 cal, 250 grain projectile up to 2,800 feet per second. There's just not enough power, but with a 225, that's where these numbers are coming from. It still stands right alongside the 338 Lapua. And this you're looking at like $3 a round, $2 a round, where a 338 Lapua, I think it's like 10 bucks a round. So what are you more likely to miss? The slight advantage a 338 Lapua gives you? Or are you likely to miss with a 338 Lapua because you can shoot it, what, like 5 times less than a 300 PRC, so you'd have 5 times more trigger time on a 300 PRC over 338 Lapua. I believe that the more trigger time would be more likely to get you on target than the slight ballistic advantage of a 338 Lapua. So, basically how this boils down to, unless you're consistently shooting at 800 yards, the better choice would be a 243. Because the 6.5 needs to go all the way out to 800 yards before it catches up with the 243. Remember, this is only a 90 grain. This is just store-bought ammunition. It gets way worse if you start hand loading. So, inside of 300, which is basically my area, I have to search. I have to drive very long distances to be able to shoot at a target farther than 300. Just because we have trees, and they really limit the amount of range you can shoot a particular rifle at. So because of the trees, the advantages that I get on a 243 or a 6.5 Creedmoor, they're really kind of not there. And that's why I'm a big fan of 308. Because chances are, my target is going to be within inside of 300 yards, without a doubt. And you get a little bit more kinetic energy with the 308 inside those closer ranges because it hasn't started to fall off yet. Does the kinetic energy matter? No. Point. Tell me where the spot is where I can get hit with a 243 or a 6.5 Creedmoor, and I will survive, but if I get hit in that exact same spot with a 308, I will not survive. You can't. They're too ballistically similar. The target isn't going to know the difference. So, in my area, again, let's recap here. I'm maxed out at about 300 yards. So for me, because of how much cheaper a 308 is, how much more available it is, it makes sense for me to go with a 308. Now, if I lived in an area that basically maxed out at 500 yards, and I was going to consistently shoot 500 yards, no question in my mind, I would go with a 6mm. More specifically, a 243. I'd take that AR-10 and I'd put on a 243 barrel. Because the 243 outperforms 6.5 and 308 like pretty bad at 500 yards. Like for example for the drop, 7.9 compared to 9.7 compared to 11.7. These are what the targets look like. Look at the difference in drop there. And the wind drift is negligible. Yeah, you do get a little bit more on 243, but it's just a touch over 1 MOA. So that's an extra 5 inches. So if you were already going to miss with the 243, chances are you would either just be grazing the target or you still would have missed with the 6.5 Creedmoor. Now, if I'm shooting 800 consistently, the first thing I'm going to do is ask myself, why the hell ain't I using a bolt gun? The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the calibers. And at 800 yards, yes, now the 6.5 Creedmoor is starting to put a noticeable advantage over the 243 and the 308 just because of how much less wind drift it has. It's not quite half as much, but it's getting pretty damn close. So now a gust of wind can make the difference between hitting the target and not hitting the target depending on what particular caliber you're using. Obviously, over 800, well, now I'm going to a bolt gun and I'm going to a 300 PRC. Anyway, I hope you found this video at least entertaining, if not educational. Again, you can support my channel directly by purchasing a Freedom Star with not one, but two Scar 17s, the best battle rifle ever made, on a single patch. With the Only Tactical Fans logo on it. From my Shopify store right there, shoponlytacticalfans.com. Otherwise, you can also donate directly on PayPal. And I have affiliate links in the description down below. Just by clicking on those particular links. Just clicking on it. And doing the Amazon shopping you were already going to do anyway. Even if you don't purchase what that link is for. I still get a little kickback because you came there off my channel. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.